Well, for a long time, the concept of sovereignty only had a religious meaning, that people would say that God is sovereign because there's no one who's above God in authority. There's nobody who can second-guess God or overrule God. So that's what sovereignty really means. Now, when we think about it in terms of politics, when you're going to say who or what is sovereign, we mean who has the final say on whatever it is. That's where sovereignty resides. So, for example, a colony is not totally sovereign because there's always a mother country that can overrule it. So the question is, in the American context, where does the sovereignty reside? Now, in the old world, you would find people saying the king is sovereign. He is your divinely given sovereign. Or, in some sense, the state is sovereign. But, in other words, the national government would be sovereign. But the American view was much different from this old world view. The American view was that there is no government that's sovereign. There's no government that has the final say on anything. It's the peoples of the states who are the sovereigns. It's the people of South Carolina, the people of North Carolina, the people of New Hampshire. Those are the sovereigns.
And that was a major departure from everything in man's past, for the most part, wouldn't you say?
That's the idea, that this is something new under the sun. And so this means then, and you see how this plays an important part in making sense of nullification. Because if the peoples of the states are the sovereign entities here, and they create the federal government simply for their own convenience, obviously they are in no way required to sit back and let something they created for their own convenience crush and destroy them. They're the sovereigns. And if they're the sovereigns, if this is going to be something other than a pretty phrase that we utter, if it really is going to have any meaning, that means that in the last resort, the sovereign has the final word. Now, the sovereigns, it's true, the peoples could establish courts, and the courts could make determinations of constitutionality. They could do that in normal cases. But in the last resort, in an extraordinary case, it would fall to the sovereigns, the peoples themselves, to say, now, wait a minute, we never gave this power to the federal government. I don't care what the courts say. We are the sovereigns. The court is not. And so you see, once you get sovereignty right, everything just follows.
That's one of the problems, though, is that a central government really doesn't want anyone else to be sovereign beside
well, how
the
about
central
that?
government.
Isn't that right? That's been the history of the past few hundred years, is central governments that despise other jurisdictions and want to crowd them out, want to absorb all their functions, want to leave them just empty shells. We've seen that the French Revolution was all about that. We want to get rid of all local privileges, sweep them all away. But don't worry, we'll protect your liberties because the central government will be the guardian of your liberties now. Well, how's that worked out for the French?
Well, it hasn't worked out well for the French, but it goes back more than just a few hundred years. It goes back to the time of the Bible. Every time a group of men get together, someone wants to be the boss. And the more they want to be the boss, the more they want to control.
That's right.
And it goes up and up and up.
We did have a long period in the Middle Ages where you had competing sources of political authority. And there was no one power that could simply say, everybody, you now have to pay a 20% income tax. They didn't have the authority to do it. They didn't have the authority to do a lot of the things that we associate with governments today. The kings, we hear the word king and we think a king can do anything he wants. Not a medieval king. A lot of times there were nobles who were more powerful than he was. He was hemmed in on all sides. But modern European history is the history of these kings, these national governments, throwing off all these obstacles to their acquiring absolute power. And we've been distracted by the fact that instead of kings, we have parliaments now in Europe. But that's not really the key issue. The key issue is sovereignty. And it doesn't matter if you have 500 tyrants or one tyrant. If they're exercising absolute power, there's not a lot of difference.
This concept is so important because what you really have here is sovereign individuals who, as part of a sovereign state or colony, made a compact, and that compact was the Constitution. The central government, or the general government as they called it in that time, really was the creation of these independent sovereigns. So what we have now is a central government or federal government that has stolen the sovereignty from where it rightfully belonged.
It's interesting that John Adams even said that when representatives from the states meet in Washington, or eventually it was in Washington, that we should think of these as being a meeting of ambassadors. So that's very revealing that these people are representing sovereignties. And of course, it's also worth noting that the very text of the Constitution makes clear our point, because the United States is always referred to in the plural in the Constitution. It's never referred to as a single whole. It's a plural. It's a group of societies that have come together. And you're right, of course, now today we think of there being one indivisible blob, and it just issues commands to everybody, and no one's allowed to dissent from this. Its decisions are infallible, and they can't be overridden. And this is not, I mean, if you look at the history of early America, that's not how the peoples of the states felt. They felt like they had a role to play in the constitutional drama.
This is especially revealing if you read the minutes of the discussions of the ratifying conventions.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, these people were terrified of having a central government that could tell them anything.
That's right.
Basically, they said, well, you can do a few of these things. You know, if someone invades us, yeah, please protect us, collect a few tariffs. Otherwise, stay out of our business.
Yeah. And it's so important to know about the ratifying conventions because, as Madison says, that's where you find out what the Constitution means. Not at the Philadelphia Convention, because that was behind closed doors. Madison's notes for that convention were not made available for decades afterward. Nobody could know what had been discussed there. The only thing people could know, and this was Madison's point, was what was discussed in their state ratifying conventions. That's what they could know, and that's what their representatives agreed to. That's what they understood themselves to be doing when they ratified the Constitution. And in at least half a dozen of these ratifying conventions, they said that this federal government will have only the powers expressly delegated to them. That was the understanding in Virginia and many other states, expressly delegated. That's the key thing. So sometimes you'll hear, for example, John Marshall, who was Chief Justice from 1801 to 1835. John Marshall did so much to overturn the original decentralized republic, and Marshall said, look, the 10th Amendment doesn't say expressly delegated, so I don't know why you people think that's the meaning. But he's obviously a liar, because he was at the Virginia ratifying convention where they told the people this Constitution means expressly delegated. It doesn't matter the wording. What matters is the understanding of the ratifiers. And the understanding of the ratifiers was clear, that this is an exceptionally limited government.
But you know that people then hang on the general welfare clause, the commerce clause.
Yeah.
And
they got
say,
their favorites, right?
They got their
The
favorites.
social studies teachers of America have their... Now, if there are honorable ones watching this program right now, we accept them. But I'm talking about the run-of-the-mill.
As we used to say to my mother, name two.
Yeah.
We always say name two because she might have been able to name one.
That's
So
right. I always, just for insurance policies, I always say name three, just in case, like they had twins or something. Well, as a matter of fact, that's a reason that in my book, Nullification, that you mentioned at the beginning, I have a whole chapter, before I get into the doctrine of nullification, I have a whole chapter where I talk about the real meanings of, and they are ascertainable, by the way, the real meanings of the general welfare, commerce, and necessary and proper clauses. And then I've got a little discussion of the supremacy clause. But you have to master this before you can go any further, because how do they justify these exercises of power? It's usually with reference to one of these clauses that you mentioned. And as I say, it's not like you have to have a Ouija board to figure out what the original intent was of these clauses. They were pretty clear about this. I mean, Madison was very clear, even though Madison's opinions sometimes changed over his career. One thing he was totally consistent on was that the expansive view of the general welfare clause, that it authorized anything that might in some way be thought of as benefiting the general welfare, was unacceptable. That was an unacceptable interpretation. There's no way that could be right. He said that all through his career, all the way up through the bonus bill veto in 1817. It's not hard to find this out. Just have to look.
Well, you have to read your history. I mean, and you have to read the writings of the people who put this all together.
Right.
Even if you want to negate that you can know what their intent was, that's really not true. If they wrote,
Right. They explained it.
Yeah.
Or I had somebody, I mean, I spend a lot of time on my tomwoods.com just refuting inane articles. And one time there was a guy who said, look, you stupid Tea Party people, don't you know that Thomas Jefferson said he favored a federal role in education? What's wrong with you? And I said, well, all right, I'm not saying Jefferson's perfect, but look what you left out of his statement. He said, well, of course, we'd have to amend the Constitution before we could do this. I said, now, I guess you forgot about that. You guys are following the constitutional interpretation of that basically runs like this. Well, it would be nice for the federal government to do X, but it's not authorized in the Constitution, but it would be too much of a pain in the neck to amend the Constitution, so let's just do it anyway. Jefferson spent his career denouncing that way of thinking. So for somebody like that to cite Jefferson, I mean, really, are we to be spared nothing? This is the worst of the worst.
The ends do not justify the means, and really that's what you're
And even the ends are crummy. Like, I don't even want federal rural education.
Well, of course,
in that
particular
case, right.
That particular case, they don't.